speaker, David Shaw. He's a senior researcher at the Institute for Biomedical Ethics at the University of Basel, and also an associate professor of health ethics and law at Maastricht University. He holds a master in philosophy and English literature from University of Glasgow, also Master of Science in Philosophy, University of Edinburgh, PhD from University of Lausanne, and also a master in medical law. So his interests are in bioethics with a focus on public health and research ethics. And yeah, I think in the interest of time, stage is yours. Really.
Thanks very much. I wasn't listening to what you said there, so I assume that it's accurate. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. So I'm David Shaw from the Institute for Biomedical Ethics at the University of Basel. I loved Andrea's first slide with the lovely pictures of everyone. My credits come at the end, but everything that I'm seeing is based on work that we've done together as a team with my co-PI, Professor Bernice Elgar, and our PhD student Stephen Milford, and our postdoc Lester Darrell Genevieve. So they share the blame for what I'm about to say. Now, we're interested in ethical frameworks for autonomous systems, and specifically smart cars, and we're conducting interviews with experts on how they think those systems should be developed in order to develop socially responsible automated systems for the road. The most famous attempt to look into the morality of smart car decision making is, of course, the Moral Machine project, which has been cited thousands of times. It was in Nature, and it was a very impressive piece of scientific work. In terms of involving millions of participants all around the world in a game-like scenario to discover their moral attitudes to who should be prioritized in car crash situations. And it was heavily based on the classic trolley problem from the philosophical literature. Just out of interest, could you raise your hand if you had heard of this before I recommended the text? Yeah, okay, good stuff. So for what we're interested in, I don't think the Moral Machine project is actually very useful. It's interesting as a psychology study. It's interesting, I mean, my kids loved playing it during lockdown as a kind of adjunct to the philosophy lessons I was doing with them. But if just looking at this, you can see it's not very realistic. It gets into great detail about the different types of pedestrians that could be sacrificed under each type of scenario. As I said, it's a game-like scenario. Generally, policy should be based on reflective moral deliberation rather than intuitive, instinctive reactions. Also in that, some people are crossing the red light, so it assumes that responsibility is relevant. Now, it might be relevant, but it just always assumes that pedestrians can kind of be blamed for their actions. It also assumes utilitarian priorities, so efficiency. It's done in a way so that sometimes it's 5 people against 1, as in the classic trolley problem. It mentions all those personal characteristics like pregnant, criminal, doctor, without considering justice issues involved in doing that, even if it were practical to ever consider things like that in real scenarios. And of course, trolley problems aren't indicative of the majority of crashes or other road interactions. But there's also another problem. Now, here's my example, a variant on the trolley problem. A giant man is running out of control down a road. Ahead of him are 2 cars, one containing a slim woman and the other 2 annoying children. Which car should the giant crush? Now, this is also a variant of the other trolley problem where you have to push a fat man off a bridge to stop a train and so on. But the reason I mention this is, and some of what I'm going to say may seem obvious, but I think the implications of it for responsible automation aren't always obvious. Pedestrians can't crush cars, even if they're very big. There's an asymmetry there in the power distribution. That's just an example. So I'm not suggesting that we should ask millions of people around the world their answer to this particular question. Okay, so that's just by way of context for what I'm mainly talking about today, with a focus on pedestrians as kind of the most vulnerable type of road user. Obviously, there's other types of road user as well. Another issue with the moral machine scenario is sometimes it does have no people in the car, it's got an empty car, but even there the assumption is that pedestrians might be sacrificed in order to save an empty car, which is quite a problematic idea, even if that could be necessary under some scenarios. So pedestrians are very vulnerable and car users have lots of advantages relative to them. So in this talk, I seek to analyze those asymmetries. And we do that a lot in ethics. I mean, obviously, cars are more powerful than people. But listing the different ways in which they're more powerful is really important for informing the ethical analysis and deciding what a just and socially responsible solution is. And then I go on to talk about the UK, which actually has a new hierarchy of vulnerability on the road, which is part of the Highway Code in the United Kingdom. Okay, so the advantages for AV users, many of these also apply to regular cars, but specifically AV users. So they're protected from impact by the car. Risk of death is substantially reduced by the chassis, airbags, seatbelts, and other security features. The pedestrian is unprotected. Unlike cyclists, most pedestrians don't yet wear helmets, although you never know what's around the corner. The car users, of course, have an advanced computer trying its best to save them within the constraints of whatever algorithms we end up putting in those cars. Depending on the system that's implemented, they might have been able to implement their crash preferences. There's lots of literature on different ways to design ethics settings for a car. Also, and I'm getting into a bit of kind of personal responsibility here, passengers make cars heavier. Not a major point, but the average car in the UK weighs 1.5 tons. The average UK couple weighs 10% of that, maybe more in the west coast of Scotland. But the point being, they're increasing the weight of the car by 10% and increasing the threat posed by that car to pedestrians. Now, this is a kind of side point, but I've left it there in the middle, and it ties in with some of what Andrea was saying maybe. People who own a smart car are more likely to be well off. So I'm not saying they should be deprioritized for that reason. In fact, it's the opposite. People who are better off or richer have longer lifespans. So if you got into talking about how much life is going to be lost from saving a particular person, those in the car are likelier to lose more if they're sacrificed from that perspective. And AV users often have strength in numbers. Now, of course, there could be a group of pedestrians, but very often cars have more than one person in them. And that just automatically makes you think we should protect the people in the car because there's more of them. Why would the car swerve to hit a wall if there's 5 people in the car when it could just hit the pedestrian and keep the people in the car safe? Now, in terms of utility and efficiency, that makes sense, but that doesn't mean it should override justice. And the pedestrian, again, is the most vulnerable person on the road. And of course, because we're used to considering trolley problems all of the time, we're used to making such calculations. But of course, in a classic trolley problem, you have 1 person tied to a railway line and 5 people tied to a railway line and a train. And the choice is between killing the 1 and killing the 5, which is quite different from 5 people being protected by all the security features of a car and 1 basically naked pedestrian on the road. So getting specifically into the asymmetries, again, obvious facts. Cars are fast, heavy, and hard. Pedestrians are slow, light, and soft. Pedestrians don't constitute a threat. So in the kind of language of warfare and the ethics of these situations, they're innocent bystanders. Now, of course, pedestrians can contribute to deaths and injuries on the road because cars react to pedestrians, and there can be harm as a result of that. Cars and their passengers, by contrast, constitute a threat to the lives of pedestrians. And we could get into a debate about whether it's an innocent threat or not, but say it's 1 man in a car, he's brought that car onto the road when he could presumably use some other method of transport. So it could be argued that the car users have introduced a deadly threat to a public space, more deadly than a pedestrian at least. And even if they mean no harm, they've increased the danger to the pedestrian by using a vehicle rather than going on foot. So here's another example with an old-fashioned title. So imagine it's not cars, it's fast-moving steel balls rolling quickly down the street. One person is inside the ball, increasing its weight and threat, as I said earlier, and there's a pedestrian ahead. If the ball hits the pedestrian will almost certainly be killed. If the ball hits a wall, the person inside it will possibly be killed. Now, that sounds bonkers, right? But it's, apart from the shape of the thing that's going down the road, is kind of what you're doing with a car. Okay, so obviously the person who's brought the ball of steel onto the road should probably be more at risk of any harms that result, especially given they're less likely to die. Okay, so this is actually a quote from an old colleague of mine, Helen Frau. Well, it's the same university. Accounts of self-defense are often divided into two camps: extended accounts and restricted accounts. Extended accounts permit the killing of at least some innocent people in self-defense. For example, they permit the killing of a falling person who is hurtling helplessly towards a victim as the victim stands trapped at the bottom of a well. If the only way that victim can stop falling person from crushing him to death is by vaporizing her with his ray gun, the extended self-defense doctrine accounts permit him to do so. So it's another kind of crazy philosophical example. Someone's trapped down a well, someone's falling towards them. It's not the falling person's fault, but the person at the bottom of the well is going to die unless they zap them with their laser gun. Now, again, another silly philosophical example, and I'm not suggesting we give philosophers ray guns to shoot at cars. This is more to show that the philosophical literature is in agreement that whether the person is innocently in charge of an AV on the road or they shouldn't be doing so, the pedestrian has a right to self-defense, even if they don't have a means to self-defense. So obviously cars are deadly, but there's no such thing as a deadly pedestrian. So how can we address the vulnerabilities of pedestrians? And not just pedestrians, cyclists, people using horses, other more vulnerable road users. So that's just to reiterate the asymmetries. Car users are protected by the car. They have a smart computer. They might be able to set preferences. They're more likely to be socioeconomically advantaged, although I'm not blaming them for that yet. They increase the threat posed by the weight of the car and adding to it. And if it comes down to a choice between a lone pedestrian and multiple passengers, they also enjoy strength in numbers. So the only way of addressing the balance, given the advantages held by car users, is for the car to prioritise pedestrians for protection over car occupants. That should be a basic rule before any considerations of responsibility or utility. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't consider utility. Of course we should, but our current thinking, and it may change, is that justice comes first, fairness comes first. So if there's one pedestrian but two people in the car, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because there's two of them, they get priority. I don't know where the line is, and it would have to feed into the kind of things that Andrea was talking about trade-offs between efficiency, fairness, and scalability. But I think the correct conclusion will often be that the car should simply hit the nearest available wall and hope that 2 tons of armour, airbags and safety systems protect the passengers. And again, it's a slightly artificial situation, just using that as an example. But of course, if the AV is actually a bus full of school children, I concede that the pedestrian is probably going to be deprioritised in a case like that. I do drive a car, in case you had any doubts about that. Using pedestrian responsibility as a factor is likely to be too complex. So you say, oh, well, that person was drunk, he ran out on the road. Feeding that into things is likely to be too complex, even if it were deemed ethical to start attributing responsibility in that way. So actually, the simplest solution in terms of policy would be for cars to act as if pedestrians really were deadly, as this would mean that cars would have to avoid hitting them at all costs, like this guy. Now, hopefully our AVs won't be playing Minecraft, but if you program them to treat pedestrians like creepers, they would steer well clear of them. Now, that's the end of the first part of what I'm saying, and obviously it was a bit philosophical, but I hope you can see the kind of practical ramifications of some of the ethical analysis and what I was saying. And this isn't all we're looking at, but I think you have to start with the framework somewhere, and previously we were looking at vulnerability, and I think just looking at pedestrians versus cars is a good way to highlight the different aspects of vulnerability. So we were writing that paper, and around the same time as we were starting to write it, the UK actually updated the Highway Code. Now, the Highway Code's an interesting document. It has parts of it are law, and parts of it are guidance. If it says must in the highway code, that means it's a law. So if you don't obey that part, you're breaking the law. But quite a lot of the time it says should. Okay, so you're not breaking the law, but it could be taken into account if you disobey a should rule if you end up in court for some kind of driving infraction. So it's some of it is soft law and some of it is hard law. So the main thing that's new in the highway code is they've introduced this hierarchy of road users. It places those road users most at risk in the event of a collision at the top of the hierarchy. It does not remove the need for everyone to behave responsibly. So the first rule, it's important that all road users are aware of the code, are considerate to other road users, and understand the responsibility. Everyone suffers when road collisions occur, but those in charge of vehicles that can cause the greatest harm in the event of collision bear the greatest responsibility to take care and reduce the danger they pose to others. Most strongly to drivers of large goods, passenger vehicles, vans, minibuses, cars, taxis, and motorcycles. And then you go down one level to cyclists, horse riders, and drivers of horse-drawn vehicles. Sounds very old-fashioned. Likewise, have a responsibility to reduce danger to pedestrians. And none of this detracts from the responsibility of all road users. So we don't need to go through all this, but it does go into great detail, and you can easily access it online if you're interested. But it goes through the rules. You have to give way to pedestrians, and this was the car lobby was up in arms about this one. So any junction in Britain that doesn't have traffic lights, a car should stop for you now. So kind of like Switzerland with its yellow zebra crossings, but there aren't yellow zebra crossings, and it's a brave pedestrian who assumes that all drivers are aware of this new feature of the highway code. And then it goes into more specifics there. That's just to give you an idea. Rule H3, again, similar stuff except for drivers and motorcyclists. But more interesting from our perspective is Rule 204, which is way down in the document. The road users most likely to be injured in the event of a collision are pedestrians, cyclists, horse riders, and motorcyclists, with children, older adults, and disabled people being more at risk. So what it's saying is responsibility is inversely proportional to vulnerability, and car users basically have a responsibility to protect the most vulnerable people, even if they have an instinct to protect themselves. Rule 207 goes into more detail on particularly vulnerable pedestrians, including children and older pedestrians. And some of you will be aware of that. At 40 miles per hour, your vehicle will probably kill any pedestrian it hits, but at 20 miles per hour, they've only got a 5% chance of being killed, so kill your speed. Older pedestrians may need more time to cross the road. People with disabilities and hearing problems will be more of an issue, and goes through blind and deafblind people as well. But what's interesting, I think, is to be more precise about this. There's different types of vulnerability. In the H1 rule, vulnerability is defined in terms of the risk of being injured if you're in a collision. So if you're a pedestrian in a collision, you're more likely to be injured than a car driver who's in that collision. But Rule 207 used another sense of vulnerability, which is the risk of being in a collision. So older people and children are more likely to be in a collision. So it's not a major issue, but it's not, the code doesn't spell this out. You have to read it closely and realize it's talking about two different senses of vulnerability. And of course, there are other senses of vulnerability, including risk of death in a given scenario of everyone involved, and the overall risk of death on the roads. So just for example, more people die and more passengers in cars die on British roads every year than do pedestrians, because there's so many more car journeys and so many people using cars. So these are all different types of risk and vulnerability. So drivers have a responsibility to protect more vulnerable road users, such as pedestrians, by avoiding them in potential collision situation. That's Rule H1. And to take particular care to avoid collisions with elderly people, children, and disabled people. To watch out for them more, because they're more likely to get into an accident. But of course, this doesn't mean that drivers, if there's two pedestrians, should necessarily prioritize the disabled person for protection over a non-disabled person if they've got a choice between them. So this is just to note that any further specification of prioritization between pedestrians would have to be clear about the rationale for favouring particular groups or disfavouring particular groups. So what does this mean for autonomous vehicles and socially responsible roads? And it does mention autonomous vehicles in the code. The British Law Commission recently had a long report on how autonomous vehicles should be legislated for in Britain. Well, the code states that these vehicles are capable of safely driving themselves when the self-driving function is correctly turned on and the driver follows the manufacturer's instructions. And that implies that manufacturers will comply with the code and, by implication, the hierarchy within it. But again, it didn't actually say must in any of the hierarchical rules. It only said should, but it still strongly implied and expected that those designing systems for cars in Britain, at least, will respect the hierarchy. And given what H1 says, this means that autonomous vehicles would have responsibility to avoid hitting pedestrians, even if the alternative is hitting a wall. So as I said, this part of the code is guidance rather than law because it doesn't say must. But actually, and I was very pleased to see this given I was writing the other paper at the same time, the UK Highway Code effectively renders pedestrians deadly because if you obey the hierarchy, you should not be hitting pedestrians. Basically at any cost. And that's probably going too far, but of course they weren't thinking in that level of detail about autonomous vehicles yet when they wrote the code. But in any case, this has major implications for the design of smart car decision-making systems. So in conclusion, pedestrians are much more vulnerable than car users, whether they're autonomous vehicles or not. Crash scenarios are so asymmetrical that trolley problems are probably not an appropriate way to consider them. When you're actually looking at real scenarios, they are useful handles for ethics discussion. More vulnerable road users must be protected to a greater extent than car users, and the hierarchy of responsibility in the roads is one promising approach to social responsibility and automation. But more work is clearly needed to clarify the trade-offs between justice and utility, and I guess scalability as well, and any consideration of vulnerability in this context. So just to say thanks to the NCCR and the SNF, and as I said, my co-PI Bernice, our postdoc Lester, and our PhD student Stephen, who is doing great work on the project. And I'll just end with one last, hopefully the last ever trolley problem I will use in a presentation. A runaway trolley is about to create 5 trolley problems. Do you pull the lever and divert it so that it only creates one? That'll give you a headache if you look at it too closely. Thanks very much.
Questions?
Actually, I was wondering how you reason about causality in these things. Causality in the time sense, not the information.
Yeah.
So that should it be judged post-mortem, or should it be on the human's best available information at the time? When you come to an autonomous system, there's some expectation that it can make a post-mortem prediction.
Yeah.
And that where a human is probably not.
Right. So, well, I mean, if it's for humans, I mean, I think the main thing humans can do is just not act intuitively, not kill their family saving a squirrel, kind of thing. But that's an interesting point. No, I think it depends. The answer to the question depends on which type of answer you want. In terms of ethics, it's to do the best possible in the scenario. In terms of the law, it's more backwards looking and saying, did that person, should that person have acted differently? But generally, people without smart cars in these scenarios panic, and the law is quite soft on them. And as you rightly point out, that will not be the case with autonomous vehicles. Andrea.
Thanks for the talk. While you were giving it and kind of apologizing for being a philosopher, I was thinking actually my title is Doctor of Philosophy.
Oh,
right. Like many of us here.
Yeah.
So my question is the following. You talk about responsibility of users and whether that can influence or not the choices that need to be made. I was thinking, is that I think there's a step missing, right? Because is it because there's a sort of social contract in which people are guaranteed that if they follow the rules, then nothing will happen to them? Like I think that it's very difficult to talk about these kind of issues of responsibility or expectations before a framework of what I'm supposed to.
Sure. No, I should have. I meant to say that at the start. It's the Institute for Biomedical Ethics, so we're used to doing work about public spaces and responsibility to each other. I mean, obviously with COVID, we wrote a lot about that. So you're right that I guess the kind of hidden premise is roads are public spaces. We all have responsibilities to other people in public spaces, whether it's controlling your dog in a park or controlling your car on a road. But I guess also not necessarily from the bioethics side, but just from me, I guess I'm trying to think which of your categories I fall into, but I think people have a right to non-interference and a right to expect not to be killed in public places through no fault of their own. And I'm not sure what I'm going to think about responsibility when we look at that in more depth, because I realize there's a tension, because I'm seeing car owners bear some responsibility for bringing the cars onto the road because they're introducing a threat to a public space. I'm less sure that you should blame pedestrians for walking out. I mean, as the Highway Code said, they have some responsibility for that. But even if a pedestrian does walk out, they're still not bringing a deadly threat into a public space, unless the rules are designed in such a way that they're so sympathetic to pedestrians that pedestrians really become deadly to all other road users.
I don't like to use the word blame.
Yeah, sure. No, but it's just shorthand for attributing responsibility. Yeah, sure, yeah, completely.
Because you could blame everybody. Maybe everybody's at fault, but then, you know.
Yeah, I'm getting old. I like to do that.
No, but you know, there's an expression in the US like blaming the victim.
Victim blaming, yeah.
But this is not about blame. It's about liability, right? Because if you're a pedestrian, you might put cars in danger by doing something, right? Because if they need to avoid you, then.
Yeah, no, exactly. And in the paper, we go into more depth about that. I mean, not all pedestrians are innocent bystanders. Some are innocent threats in the sense that they make someone react in a way that could be deadly, and some might be non-innocent threats, even if you're not going to blame them for that. But yeah, it's just in the other context of, I've also got a paper coming out soon about responsible behaviour of dog owners in public places, and I've experienced with some dog owners, they're so defensive of their dog, more than I would ever be of my children. But they actually end up not just victim blaming, but gaslighting, saying things like, your kids shouldn't be, if they're playing, they should be in the play park, and things like this. So sorry, that's an aside, but just another aspect of behaviour in public spaces. Sorry, Rob, yeah?
Along the same lines, it seems like you reverse things around. So you said that if I bring the car onto the road, I'm responsible for that. I'm licensed to do that. But in this scenario, if you have a crazy person that jumps in front of your car right next to a wall, that crazy person is now actively able to harm the person in the car, right? But now let's say we can't license the person to walk down the street.
Well, no, but it's interesting. I mean, I totally take your point, yeah. And I walk more than I drive is maybe a kind of conflict of interest statement for this, for this paper. But no, that's a good point. But there's still, and we do make that point in the paper, the crazy person in that scenario does pose a threat, but it's a threat of avoidance rather than them bringing a dangerous thing into a public space. That you could, and of course we can argue about whether that's a relevant distinction or not. But your point about licensing is in Britain, when this highway code came out, the whole conversation started again about cyclists. Once cyclists start getting licenses and paying insurance, then I'll respect them on the road, which basically amounts to saying I'm going to keep potentially killing them until that happens. So given that some of that discourse, I wouldn't be surprised if people said that we should license pedestrians in that sense. But I fully acknowledge that. I mean, that's going to be a future paper, one on responsibility, one on the kind of numbers and trade-off aspects of this. But as the Highway Code says, everyone has a responsibility to act responsibly on the road. And I could imagine totally unforeseen sudden interjection of pedestrian could lead to lower priority on some algorithm because of that, even if you don't have access to their psychiatric records.
Sorry, I just have, what was the law in the UK before this? Like you mentioned, like the zebra crosswalk. Like I'm not actually like I've heard of this, and when I read it, I was like, isn't that already the law? In in the US. Well,
it was kind of the hierarchy was kind of implicit. It's like it didn't say you have a greater responsibility. They didn't say this thing about being proportional to the degree of threat and so on. But basically, no, it wasn't articulated. Like if it was just a regular suburban junction, cars would just go and you would just have to wait for the car to pass, and that wasn't protected in the code. And there aren't many zebra crossings in Britain anymore. They've put in more traffic lights. So Switzerland, I mean, I still, even though I spent many years in Switzerland now, I still feel like a Jedi when I cross the road. And it's good, because otherwise we go back to Britain and probably get killed trying to do so, because they're all like driving ATATs around the place. But yeah, so actually, but that was why it was interesting, because there was rage from some of the road lobby people when this highway code came out, because they see cyclists have too much power, and they rightly say that, okay, fair enough, if you know this is the code and you see a pedestrian step out, you need to give them priority. But the guy behind you doesn't know that. He's not seen the pedestrian. You don't want him going into the back of you. So there's corollary complications of that.
I have a difficult question.
Mm-hmm.
So we're very happy to have you embedded in the NCCR, our embedded philosopher. I wonder whether, I mean, if you have a view of how can we get better at this kind of problems, because we have a deep, so it's not our personal responsibility, it's because we develop systems and then we have. So what do you think about that?
Just practice. I mean, and I guess, I mean, you were talking about, you run the models hundreds of times, not that kind of practice. And I don't think the trolley problem is useful, but I think just this kind of mapping of scenarios, whether you call them, not the trolley problem, but thought experiments can be useful, also in medicine, also in sciences. I mean, and this is what I said when I joined the NCCR. My experience is more working with doctors and biologists and so on. But what we do in ethics so much of the time, and also I'm a chair of a research ethics committee, and someone sends you a protocol, it seems perfectly reasonable, but then you sit and you think, you just map possible futures flowing out from that. And you can do the same with scenarios. And I think it would be useful for everyone in the NCCR to just, and it's, again, it sounds really simple, but just to sit and think, and you end up with some things that are obvious, but if you keep thinking about it, you're going to end up with some things that aren't obvious and have implications for other aspects of automated systems. So I don't know what the best type of scenarios are to work on. I don't think it's the trolley problem. And what I like about the kind of work that your group is doing is as you say, it's two cars meet at an intersection. It's more mundane, and that's maybe more about the economics and the kind of prisoner's dilemmas of this as well. But I think the real nitty-gritty of it is going to be when we come from the ethics. I mean, I love that slide of yours with the scalability, the fairness, and the efficiency. Because that's also the thing generally with artificial intelligence, of course, in terms of explainability, you might have a trade-off in efficiency. So what we need, I think, is different scenarios to think about together and discuss. And the difficult part, like I said, is a school bus, the pedestrian dies. There's one person in a car, the pedestrian should definitely survive. Those are the extremes, but we need good scenarios to discuss and map all of the ethics of these more mundane scenarios in between.
Thanks a lot. I'm sorry to interrupt.